Welcome back. I know it's been a long time between episodes, so thank you all for your patience while I sort my personal life out, business life out, and now I've got my property investors hat on today. So thank you for your patience. And as I said in my last post, I do hope to do these videos regularly for you. It may not be on a weekly basis so that I can achieve all of those things and balance life out, but I hope to be able to give you this regular information. So today we're talking about risk management. So this is a subject, I guess, that I'm fairly passionate about. Being in property management for almost 23 years now, I've come to learn that managing properties is one thing, but we really do specialise in risk management. So that's what we do as property managers. We manage people and we manage risks. So this is what we're talking about today. So one of the things I wanted to touch on is tenant selection, and I know that's a great place to start, obviously, is making sure we have the right people in the property. So obviously we're dealing with private owners and we're dealing with real estate agents. So there are several, obviously, arrangements with managing tenancies. So I'll talk about in general, I guess, the things to look out for when you're selecting a tenant and how to go about that, because it really does start at the point of marketing and dealing with the inquiry that comes through for each particular property that we're working with. So as an agency, I guess it starts with working and qualifying potential tenants or potential leads for the property. It's the same with sales, I guess, but to a larger degree, because we need to make sure the people that we're selecting are going to care for the property and maintain it and pay the rent and do all of those things. When you sell a property, of course, you don't care about those things once that happens. So it's a very different arrangement from that perspective. So talking on tenant selection, one of the things that we do as an office, and not every office is the same, is we qualify the inquiry as it comes in, rather than, I guess, the typical arrangement of having an open home, having people turn up and then make an application for the property. That can become very difficult in, I guess, selecting and finding the best possible tenant, because you're dealing with paper more than you're dealing with people. So by qualifying and asking a few questions before you actually go down the track of the inspection of the property, you're able to get a better idea of who you're working with and whether or not they match the needs of the client, so the property owner. So if you're a private owner, I would encourage you just to ask a few questions leading up to that inspection to make sure that they're going to be the right fit. And they're things like, when are they ready to move, for example, and making sure the dates work out. Do they have pets? Another question, how many occupants are looking to occupy the property? Because if it is a situation where it's a 2-bedroom property, 4 or 5 people might not work with that arrangement. That's another question. Do they have rent and bond ready to pay to secure the property before they are approved for the property? So these are things that you can ask leading up to that inspection, rather than doing that after they make the application. So what you're doing by going down that track is narrowing down the best possible applicants for the property. You're then able to meet them at the property one-on-one and get a better idea, face-to-face, who you're dealing with. So that's what, I guess, as an agency we do to make sure that we are working with the right selection of people to start with. So that's tip number one. The other is, obviously, once you do receive an application, you need to make sure that you don't cut corners when it comes to reference checking. And I think probably private owners are more guilty of this because of time constraints. It's, they're doing that in the middle of a workday perhaps, whereas property manager, that's their job, and they're obviously going to be a little bit more diligent with checking all of those references. So as a private owner, I would recommend that you don't cut corners when you're checking references. And when I say references, you need to be able to establish whether or not that particular tenant is likely to be able to care for the property and likely to be able to afford to pay the rent, and also get a bit of an idea of whether or not you think they're going to be reasonable, because that's another big thing. You might have someone that pays rent, you might have someone that obviously can afford the property, and you might have someone that meets the terms of the tenancy, but they might be a little bit difficult to get along with, and they might be constantly harassing you for things that might not really need to be done. So I guess you need to get along with the person that's going to be renting your property. So that's the other thing. The last is making sure you get a credit history report. And a lot of property owners, once again, don't ask for this information. The credit history report gives you obviously a detailed check of whether or not there are any debts owing, whether there's anything outstanding. And also it does list all of the previous addresses that person has lived at. So if you find there are any gaps between what's listed on the credit report and what's listed on the application, you might want to ask some questions around why those gaps are there, and obviously some questions around the history of the property that may not be listed on the application. So these are the things that obviously property agents are doing. With your employment checks, I would suggest making sure that you speak to the organisation and you confirm the employment and also the income and salary. So that's another tip in relation to that. One last thing, when you are taking through the prospective tenant, taking them through the property, make sure you're very clear about the inclusions with the property and the exclusions. So quite commonly you'll find that there can be some confusion around that. For example, if you have a wood heater in a property and also a reverse cycle air conditioner, perhaps you've put the air conditioner in the property to supersede the wood heater because it doesn't work that effectively. If you don't exclude that wood heater from the tenancy, and that's made very clear from the beginning in the advertising the property and also as a special condition in that lease agreement, you are obligated to maintain both items. So you could be in a position where you're perhaps having to replace a wood heater that you never intended to keep as the main source of heating. So that's just one example. Be clear on your inclusions and exclusions. So once you've decided on the best possible applicant, that's when you'll go down the path of the approval. So I would suggest having that discussion with your applicant and talking about the terms moving forward. So be careful not to stop advertising the property until such time as you have actually secured a tenancy, and that means a signed tenancy agreement and also the deposit of the rent and bond. You might have a signed tenancy agreement, the money's not in the bank. If you have a situation where the tenant decides that they no longer want to move into the property, whilst you have a contract, you don't have a security deposit to actually, hold that tenant responsible for the rent moving forward. So make sure you have both within about a 24 to 48 hour period before you remove the advertising of the property. So that's a really good tip, and I know even a lot of agencies don't do that. They'll get a signed contract and they'll allow the applicant to pay the rent and bond getting closer to the time when they're moving in, which is not great security for you as a property owner. So that would be my point in relation to that. The next thing, once you have actually approved and signed the tenancy agreement documents, and obviously make sure that you do have an approved tenancy agreement, because you can write anything into a lease or a contract, but if the Tenancy Act contradicts that agreement, the Tenancy Act will override it. So it's pointless having that information in your tenancy agreement. So make sure that your tenancy agreement is in line with the current Residential Tenancy Act and that everyone understands their obligation. That's both the property owner and also the occupant of the property. It's really important that both parties are very clear on the rules around renting. I think a mistake a lot of property owners and agencies might make is that they email a lease document or they ask the occupant to sit and read through the document and then sign it, rather than having what we have, which is an induction process where we sit down and actually go through the terms of the agreement and we talk about it in layman's terms so that everyone really understands what the obligations are. So it's setting those things up from the beginning so that you don't have problems later on when you're dealing with the tenancy. So we do that as an office and sit down and go through the terms so that everyone's very clear on that. The next part, after you've actually signed the tenancy documents and you're waiting for the lease to start, that might be within a couple of days, that might be within a couple of weeks, depending on what's been negotiated there, is preparing the property for rent, making sure that you're covering off on all the risks in terms of the condition of the property. So we call this a property or entry property condition report. Some people call it a PCR, that's short for property condition report. So what this is a document that describes the current condition of the property. It is the most important document apart from the lease agreement that you can have for a tenancy to protect the owner and also the tenant in relation to the condition. So what it describes are any discrepancies with the condition of the property, and even if you have a new property, there will be defects and there will be things that you need to note down before a tenant moves in. So what happens once you've prepared that, and as an agency we prepare very detailed condition reports along with anywhere up to 700-800 photographs to go with that and dated photos. I would suggest that as a property owner you certainly have that information, because you will need it if there's ever a discrepancy at the end. What happens then, the tenant is provided with that report and they have 3 working days to return that with any changes that they feel they need to make if there's something that might be missed. So they do have the opportunity to pick up on things whilst they're moving into the property and describe that on the condition report. A suggestion for property owners there, if you do have multiple changes and you feel that they might not quite be correct, make sure you address them, because that condition report will be used as evidence if there's ever a dispute. So if a tenant suggests that there are multiple marks on the walls and you've noted that there are very few marks on the walls, you would ask the tenant to provide you with some evidence of that in the form of a photo, or you might want to go back and re-inspect and have a look what they're referring to. But make sure it's documented, because that will be the expectation at the end of the tenancy. So it does protect both parties. The last thing that I'll cover off on is insurance. So I have talked about this in a previous episode, but only touched on this briefly. It's very important that you make sure that you have a comprehensive landlord insurance, because whilst you do have a bond in place, which relates to the end of the tenancy and any discrepancies, you do also need to factor in that you may exceed the bond when it comes to making a claim against the tenant if there's something not right at the end of the tenancy. In my experience, 4 weeks rent doesn't go very far if you've got a property that needs a full clean, and there are also discrepancies with the condition of the property. Also, if you have a situation where there might be a pet, if there's a pet inside the property and the pet causes damage, that can be thousands of dollars worth of replacement carpet, flooring, lots of things can sort of take place there. So I would suggest that have a look at your landlord insurance product. Once again, contact me if you'd like some questions to ask. I can't give insurance advice. Once again, disclaimer that I'm not qualified to give advice on insurance, but I can give you the information. I can give you the questions that you should be asking to make sure you have adequate cover. Some of the things include pet damage. Now, very few insurance covers will give you pet damage as part of the policy. It's relatively new to a couple of products that I'm aware of, that you can get cover for pet related damages, whether that's inside or outside of the premises. The other is, does the policy cover accidental damage and malicious damage? So you want to make sure you've got all bases covered there in terms of damage. Loss of rent is another one. And find out how much the excess is that relates to all of those different areas of the product. So more than happy to talk to anyone that would like to have a discussion about that, whether you're a private owner or whether you're with another agent, or even if you're currently working with us and you'd like to know more about that, happy to talk to you about that, because it is a really important part of risk management. As an office, as an agent, I quite often get asked the question, well, why do I need insurance when I'm paying you to do that risk management? It's a fair question. We can only do so much when it comes to dealing with a change of circumstance with a tenant, and that's quite often what happens. It's not necessarily that we selected a bad tenant, it's that things change and circumstances change, job loss. There's all sorts of things, separations where one party might be left in the property, they can no longer afford the rent. So there are lots of things that can change, and all that we can do as managing agents is mitigate that loss, and part of that is giving good advice on what you need to have in place to protect yourself from that perspective. So that would be my final tip on risk management. Naturally, there's a whole range of other things that we do as property managers to manage risk. This is more around the tenant selection and obviously setting up for that longevity tenancy. So thank you so much for tuning in. I won't say see you next week, but I will say see you soon, and hopefully that will be over the next couple of weeks and we'll cover another topic. Thank you.